I think that one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in favor of the pro-life position is all of the notable figures, abortionists, activists, politicians who started on the other side of the issue, were quite compelled of the right to abortion, but who forsook that position and then came to the other side. Perhaps the most notable that I've ever heard of, at least, is Dr. Bernard Nathanson. What you have in this case is an abortionist who presided over, I think it's 60,000 abortions over the course of his tenure, and indeed was a co-founder of one of the most prominent pro-abortion organizations in this country, NARAL, who came up against some very difficult facts to square with the pro-abortion position. Simply the fact that life, not from a religious perspective, but indeed from a biological perspective, begins at conception. And it was coming up against that fact that led this renowned abortionist and abortion activist to become pro-life, not on religious grounds, but on the basis of scientific fact, that human life begins at conception. Well, I'm here today with Dr. Ryan Anderson, who recently published a book, Tearing Us Apart, How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. I've recently read the book and would commend it to all of you. Dr. Anderson, you take up this point that human life begins at conception. And can you tell us a little bit about your arguments in favor of that position?
Sure. Yeah, no, first, happy to be with you today, and thanks for doing these videos. I can remember the first time, my wife and I currently have 3 kids, first time we ever go in for the ultrasound. And as like a first time father, I have no idea what I'm looking at, which way's up and down.
Right.
And the ultrasound technician never used the word fetus.
Right.
She never used the word fetal cardiac pulsing activity, polar activity. What she said repeatedly was, this is your baby. Mm-hmm. This is your baby's heartbeat.
Right.
This is your baby's face. That's your baby's butt. Helps me see which way's up, which way's down. And it's very obvious when you are happy about pregnancy what the subject of the pregnancy is, right? What the object in the womb is. Everyone knows it. That's the human baby. That's a human being.
That's right.
That's a human person. Why can we say this with scientific kind of rigor is that we now know the sperm and the egg. We knew this when we discovered this back in the 1800s.
Right. This isn't new news.
This isn't new news.
Right.
But now with 4D ultrasounds,
right,
it's undeniable because it's so visually transparent. But what we know is that the sperm is both functionally and genetically a part of the father's body.
Right.
The ovum, singular, is part of the woman's body, both functionally and genetically. But the embryo is distinct from both.
That's
right? The embryo is not a part of my body. It's not a part of my wife's body. It is housed inside of my wife's body for the first 9 months of his or her existence.
That's right.
And that human embryo is sexed from the moment of conception. Right? It's either a male or a female, which is why we should use kind of gendered terms there, right?
That's right.
He or she will then continue with his or her own developmental trajectory. That embryonic stage of existence, going through a blastocyst, a fetus, a newborn, a toddler, a young adult, a focused missionary. Those aren't, 5 or 6 different organisms. That's the life cycle of one single organism. Each and every one of us was once a teenager. We were each once a toddler. We were each once a newborn. We were each once a fetus. We were once an embryo. None of us was ever an egg or a sperm.
That's right.
And this is just at this point scientifically undeniable, which is why, unfortunately, the most rigorous pro-choice activists, they no longer make the argument it's just a clump of cells or we don't know when life begins. They make a different argument.
That's right. Yeah, and so I'd like to move to that different argument now, and you might not hear it as much kind of at the ground level, but like you said, some of the more sophisticated pro-choice advocates might say, okay, granted, human life in a biological sense does indeed begin at conception, and that's common sense. My wife and I had the same experience. We've had a number of ultrasound techs with whom we've met as our babies have been developing, and none of those ultrasound techs, when they saw the heartbeat monitor, said, I see a vibration in a clump of tissue. What they said is, I see your baby's heartbeat. Yeah. A very different thing to say that corresponds not only with biology, but with human common sense. Yep. So you might have a more sophisticated pro-abortionist say, hey, okay, granted, human life in some biological sense begins at conception, but I'm not talking about human life in the biological sense. I'm talking about personhood. Yep. And that's a distinct thing. What are abortionists saying there, pro-abortion advocates? And how would you respond to that position?
Sure. No, I mean, and you're exactly right. This is the most sophisticated argument out there. Sometimes I'll say it's somewhat a sophistical
That's right.
argument
That might
because
be a better
it's
word,
not.
yeah.
I mean, there is a sophisticated version of this. I was an undergraduate at Princeton. Peter Singer, the university's professor of human values, is well known for his support of both abortion and infanticide, because his argument is that we do not become human people until a year or two after birth.
Wow.
And here's the argument why. You and I are people right now because we can engage in personal activities. And by personal activities, what distinguishes us from chickens or dogs or cows is that we have a sense of ourself. So we have self-awareness, self-consciousness. We have higher rational capabilities. We have speech, a whole host of things that would distinguish persons from non-personal forms of life.
That's right.
Other animals. And so he won't deny the science. He says it's very clear. The life of a new human being begins at conception.
That's notable. Peter Singer.
He will readily agree that.
Right.
Because he sees that, yes, that the organism, you or me, but then he'll say something different. But you and I aren't a physical organism, right? That the personhood aspect is something different. And there are different versions of this argument. So there's like a body-self dualism, which would say you and I were never in a womb because we're not the physical body. We're just the center of consciousness. We're just the personal, rational capabilities that are somehow associated with the body, but we aren't bodily beings. So it's a very anti-Catholic understanding. We take human embodiment very seriously, both as a philosophical and theological matter. So that argument would say you and I were never in the womb. Right? We came into existence only when our personal capabilities came into existence. The other argument is that you and I were in the womb, but when we were in the womb, we were not morally valuable because we couldn't yet engage in personal actions. The flip side of this at the end of life is that if we can no longer exercise our personal capabilities, we could become human non-persons.
Wow.
So there are pre-personal human beings, the unborn. There are post-personal human beings, grandma. Right? And this is why you see the push for euthanasia and assisted suicide saying, grandma's no longer there. Right. And so it's an anti-human worldview. Why is it wrong? The reason why we have a toddler right now, we have a 2-year-old, we have a 4-year-old. The 4-year-old is talking in paragraphs. The 2-year-old has, individual words that she can kind of string together sometimes. Right. The toddler just babbles. We fully expect our toddler to one day use words strung together, one day speak in paragraphs. And the reason we can expect that today is the same reason why we could expect it a year ago when he was in the womb. It's because he has a rational, personal nature. Right. And so he's a person today. He was a person a year ago in the womb. He'll be a person a year from now, but we don't have to wait until he can immediately exercise his personal capabilities to know that he has those personal capabilities. Because of his nature, right? He's a rational animal. He's a personal animal from the moment of conception, right? He has created theological language in the image and likeness of God, right? That he's a rational and free. He's a personal creature. By contrast, we live on a farm. We have goats, sheep, ducks, chickens, rabbits, pigs, and a cow. None of those creatures will ever engage in a personal action, right? I'm not expecting one day that the duckling will talk, or that the lamb, when it becomes a sheep, will one day enter into Socratic dialogue with me. I fully expect the toddler to do that because I know that his nature is a rational nature, a personal nature, it's human nature, and that's why we can say he's not only a human being, but he's a human person from the moment of conception.
That's right. That's right. And I think it's really illuminating of people who do make this more sophisticated argument, which by the way is a small minority of abortion advocates. But those who do make that argument, many of them, in what I would take to be a very consistent fashion, will indeed argue that not only should abortion be legal, but indeed infanticide should be legal, because it's not until human biological organisms exhibit certain properties that show their rationality, their consciousness, what have you, that they should be defended under the law. And so I think that illuminates, really, for most people, the pure unacceptability, absurdity of the pro-abortion position, which runs so directly contrary to most people's common sense. Right. In that vein, let me ask you one final question, Dr. Anderson. So let's say that we grant that human life begins in a biological sense at conception, and for the reasons that you've said, that human personhood does indeed as well. Let's say that we would ask one further question, if you can give us just a brief answer to this question. Should human persons, especially vulnerable human persons, receive protection under the law?
And the short answer there is I can just quote the second paragraph of our founding document, Declaration of Independence.
There we go.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are the rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And then governments are instituted to protect these rights. I mean,
that's right.
Whenever I hear people arguing that pro-life laws are anti-American, that you're, quote, imposing your morality on me or you're imposing your theology on me, I ask them, do you think the Declaration is anti-American? Do you think the Declaration is imposing morality or imposing theology?
What could be more American
than the founding document?
Yeah.
You would think. And so what I like to point out is that on the one hand, like, yes, there is a theological foundation to pro-life laws. There's also a philosophical foundation. Laws that would prohibit fetal homicide are no more religious, but also no less religious than laws that would prohibit adult homicide. Right? I can give a philosophical argument for why the law should protect your life. I can also give a theological, and I think the theological goes deepest.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the philosophy is a penultimate discipline, and theology then takes us all the way to kind of bedrock. But the same argument that I would give for why the law should protect your life, I would also give for why the law should protect our children's lives today and our children's lives years ago when they were in the womb, right? And it all has to do with the intrinsic worth and dignity, the profound moral worth of a creature that has a personal nature, use the philosophical language, or a creature made in the image and likeness of God, use the theological language. It's an entirely appropriate role of government, of the political authority, to promote human dignity, to promote human flourishing. And the very baseline, like the bare minimum, would at least be preventing people from unjustly killing each other. Right? There's a lot more that the government should do to promote life. But at the very least, it should be preventing us from engaging in unjust forms of lethal violence inside of the womb or outside of the womb.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. That in this case, it almost seems as though the theological position confirms a position that we can know on the basis of common sense, on just ordinary reasoning. Right? This has been the first episode of the Love Life series, developed by Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, as we march joyfully into the post-Roe America. Focus is excited to walk with you, and if you have further questions about anything that Dr. Anderson has spoken about today, I'd once again commend to you his wonderful new book, Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. Thank you.